From the studios of Tucson Business RadioX, recorded in the Stewart Title corporate offices on Broadway, you are now listening to The Mark Bishop Show. And now here's your host, Mark Bishop.
And welcome to another Mark Bishop Show. You know, the 2020-21 Judicial Hellholes report ranks 9 judicial hellholes while shining a light on lawsuit abuse and its effects. So my guest is Sherman Tiger Joyce. He's president of American Tort Reform Foundation. Welcome, Sherman.
Thank you, Mark. Delighted to be here with you.
Well, for those listeners that are not aware, judicial hellholes are deemed the most unjust local courts and state civil justice systems in the country. And from my understanding, the Judicial Hellholes report digs into several concerning trends in the civil justice system, and specifically highlights the surge of COVID-19 lawsuits. And it does a bit more than that too, correct, Sherman? And what are the top issues highlighted in this year's report?
Well, that's right, Mark. Obviously, the pandemic, it's affected every aspect of our society, is affecting the litigation world. We've had over 6,000 lawsuits filed to date. But our report highlights a number of other issues that have been recurring problems before the pandemic and will survive the pandemic, unfortunately. I would mention one is what we call phantom damages, and that's when rules of evidence are used as a way to really mask the true costs of medical expenses. So, for example, if somebody is being compensated after an injury from a surgical procedure, the bill from the hospital might have a top line number of, let's just say randomly, $20,000. But if the person has medical insurance, has health care insurance, the insurer might actually settle the matter for as little as, let's just say, $4,000 or $5,000. Mm-hmm. Well, I think anybody listening would understand that the true cost of that medical procedure is that reduced cost. It's the $4,000 to $5,000. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes in court, the only evidence that's introduced that the jury would hear about is the larger figure, the so-called the billed amount, the amount that's actually at the top of that charge, as opposed to what's actually paid to settle a healthcare claim. We're also seeing in that area what we call so-called letters of protection. There's a process by which healthcare providers, oftentimes working with plaintiffs' lawyers, will involve medical finance companies. So, in effect, the receivable that as an accountant would refer to it to pay a medical claim gets in effect traded as a financial asset, and sometimes these medical claims can be dramatically inflated even more. We saw an example in testimony in the legislature in Florida earlier this year, where a woman who had identical procedures done on both of her knees after an accident, one knee cost less than $4,000 when her insurance company settled it, but the other knee involved a letter of protection and a medical finance company, and the cost got up near $60,000.
Oh,
so
my
a factor
God.
of about 15 for an identical expense. It would be as if you two people buy the same car, and one is less than $4,000, and the other pays $60 or nearly $60. So it's a complicated issue, but it really begins with educating, allowing jurors to hear the actual cost, and the cost that goes into being paid, as opposed to just some random billed amount. But even coming back to the jurisdictions, the hellhole jurisdictions, it really even begins with a more basic concern than that, and that is what cases really belong in a given jurisdiction. Courts are established to serve the interests of their communities, in terms of the state courts. But too often, and the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on this, courts seemingly are allowing themselves to become the preferred venues for lawsuits from all over the country. When that happens, because the plaintiffs' lawyers want to be in those jurisdictions, we see these cases going to places where they really don't properly belong.
Right.
And some state courts are ignoring the precedent of the U.S. Supreme Court in the process. And that's where you see it's in these jurisdictions that you see millions of dollars being spent on advertising to encourage more people to file lawsuits in these hellholes. So those are some of the key issues that we're seeing for this year.
Well, we're going to name some of those too in just a moment, but I did want to bring up that the report further highlights the American Law Institute's shift toward activism. That's correct, yes?
That's a very significant problem, and I think for lawyers who are familiar with the American Law Institute, the so-called ALI, they issue these very significant publications called restatements of the law. But we've seen a very disturbing trend in recent years in which they've gone beyond I think what had been for decades a very scholarly process of really carefully restating, as the name suggests, where the law is and likely incremental changes in the law. But in recent times, restatements such as their restatement third of torts with respect to so-called trespassers in the earlier part of this decade, the recently published law of liability insurance. Now they have a project called the law of consumer contracts, which would, if implemented by courts across the country, would dramatically impact routine contractual arrangements and empower judges to play a much, much greater role in routine cases, whether it might be credit cards, mobile phones, even the financing arrangements when you purchase or lease a car. And the ALI has really gone from, when these restatements, from being a truly scholarly organization to becoming an advocacy organization. We freely acknowledge that we are an advocacy organization. We don't expect everyone. We'd like everyone to agree with us, and we try to persuade them. But we don't enjoy this sort of patina of scholarliness that the ALI does. All the federal judges in the country are members of the American Law Institute, but these new restatement projects are very problematic, and I think they really call for greater scrutiny of really who the ALI is now and what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, Tiger Joyce, we touched on all that money before with the hospitals. You have an estimate of costs overall, and quite frankly, how do these things impact average everyday working people?
Well, it's a great question. Our estimate is that the total that we've seen from analysts is that the legal system, the civil justice system, costs over $370 billion a year. That's how much we spend as a country, and that's a obviously not insignificant amount. But I think what's really important is even to dig down a little bit deeper. For example, similar analyses in California have concluded that because, in contrast just to sort of the median civil justice system around the country, California is the number 3 judicial hellhole. But if California could reform its processes and operate more like the middle of the country, middle of the pack, it would save 240,000 jobs per year and over $15 billion in its statewide economy.
Good Lord.
Those are very significant figures.
Well, aren't they ever? But the more I hear about California, honestly, do they do anything right at all there? You know what I mean? Running out of time, I want to name and shame some of these dudes. California, Georgia, Cook, Madison, and St. Clair counties. We're talking about Illinois, Louisiana, even New York City. Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, and the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, South Carolina's asbestos litigation. It was new in 2020, and the city of St. Louis, Twin Cities in Minnesota as well. That's quite a few, isn't it?
It is. Those are some of them are a little bit new, and some have moved up, and some have been on that list for a regrettably long period of time.
Well, that's the top 9 judicial hellholes in alphabetical order, I might add. Now, how, in the last 60 seconds or so, how can we change this? What can be done for those cities to get off the list?
Well, I think the most important thing is to begin to recognize that these are problems. I mentioned the economic impact that the lawsuit abuse has on these jurisdictions. understanding that this affects everybody. This isn't just an academic or legal matter. This is a broad public policy issue, and people should read the report at judicialhellholes.org, and they should contact their public officials, and they need to make the case, indicate that this is not just, as I've mentioned, not just a problem for lawyers and judges or folks like me and the American Tort Reform Association, or even our adversaries over at the organized plaintiffs bar, but recognize that this is a public policy matter that requires reform and support for reform.
Well, there we go. You got it straight, folks. Now, look, you can go to that website and read it. I mean, there's a lot in there. Judicialhellholes.org. The ATRF, in case you didn't know, is a District of Columbia non-profit corporation founded in 1997, and their primary purpose of the foundation is to educate the general public about how the American civil justice system operates. Well, you've only heard a tiny bit of it this morning, and that's a mess, but a great job indeed from Sherman Joyce. He's the president of American Tort Reform Foundation. Thank you, Sherman. Well done, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much, Mark.